Now for our great guest today. Andrew Griffith is a British Conservative politician who has been the Conservative Shadow Secretary of State for Business and Trade since November 2024 and MP for Arundel and the South Downs since 2019. But you've had a whole range of different political roles, Andrew. Shadow Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology, Minister of State for Science, Research and Innovation, Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Exports, Director of the No. 10 Policy Unit, Economic Secretary to the Treasury. Prior to that, just in case people think you've only had a political career, you served as the Chief Financial Officer and Chief Operating Officer at Sky, as well as Chairman of Just Eat. Why on earth did you go into politics and get food and watch football in your previous life? But it seems to me you've got a great mix of political experience, business experience. So it's great to have you with us. Welcome. Fantastic to have you here. It's much to get through.
Great to be here. Much to get through. We'll figure out along the way, why. But look, the serious point is, I love our country. I'm a patriot. I got to a point in my business career that I was able to give time to do something else. I've always been a Conservative. I joined the Conservative Party at aged 14 under the great Mrs. Thatcher, who properly gave us pride back and rebooted our economy after a period of where there was a lack of growth, a failing consensus. Let's just see if we can do that again. And if I can be a small part of that mission, then that is something that should excite us all.
Great. Well, listen, let's start with something which is depressing rather than exciting. I mean, on a scale of -1,000 to -100, how bad has this Labour government been, particularly in regard to the economy, over its first, it feels like a lifetime, but they've only been in for, 14 or 15 months. The British economy is in a pretty grim state, isn't it? People argue about whether we're going to enter a technical recession or not. The media get very excited about that. I'm less bothered about whether we're technically growing at 0.1% or going backwards by 0.1%. Basically, we're flatlining. Taxes are at the highest since Clement Attlee. Regulation is being brought in more and more every day. Spending is out of control. Debt deficits. I mean, we are on a trajectory to economic destruction in the United Kingdom, aren't we? I'm not saying we're going to get there tomorrow, but that's the trajectory we're on.
Well, we're bumbling along the x-axis, exactly as you say, pretty much whatever metric you look. The forward-leaning ones on things like confidence, we're now going to have the next 2 months just every day, people concerned, fearful of the next budget that's coming. All of the metrics showing that really there's no confidence left in the economy. There's no confidence in this government. There's no latent growth from anything we're doing. There's been no profound supply side revolution for a very long time. Let me just interject, though. I am optimistic, right? First of all, you have to be optimistic to work in the postcode I now work in, because otherwise you'd just run out and bang your head against a wall. But secondly, the great British people, our innovation, the history, the heritage, the culture, our universities, all of these, the English language, rule of law, by and large, all of these are great assets. And when we get back a new centre-right government in time, as quickly as possible, but in time, all of those natural advantages remain. And so the application of a good programme of government, and I know you're going to grill me on what that might look like, can get us back. I'll give you 2 other examples. Poland. For most of our adult life, Poland really suffered under the yoke of socialism. Yeah. Right? Pretty similar socialism to the stuff we've got now, but it suffered under that yoke for nearly 40 years. Once that glacier had melted, the land lifted, and we are on track, roughly speaking, for the Polish GDP per capita to exceed that of the UK by the end of this parliament.
Yeah, right? Which you would not have believed in the 1980s.
Which you would not have believed. Singapore, genuinely, once famous for mud and malaria, right? Today, absolutely one of the highest GDP per capita countries in the world, rebuilt an economy on their own natural advantages. So it can absolutely be done. So you are absolutely right. It's really grim. There's no saving graces from this government. They're driving wealth creators away. They're attacking family businesses. The morality of what they're doing is deeply flawed, because it's a moral good to build a business, to be enterprising, to take risk, all of the things that we understand.
This is the problem, isn't it? I mean, we are not even close to drinking whatever the Poles and the Singaporeans are drinking.
No, we're going in the wrong direction.
We can point to other countries across the world who have been successful over the last 10, 15, 20 years, or I guess in Singapore's case, basically since the end of the Second World War. And we can say, well, that's a way of doing it. But we're showing no appetite to learn the lessons from this, right? As I say, taxation at the highest level since Clem Attlee, if you're measuring it as a proportion of GDP, government spending at, what is it, 43, 44% of GDP?
And not that I have a brief for this, but not all on this government's watch.
No,
right?
no, exactly.
So that point is right. Yeah. Rachel Reeves is taking us rapidly in the wrong direction.
It seems to me that she's doing everything the Conservatives did wrong and doubling it.
Oh, at least, I mean, probably, on to the power of X. But look, the darkest, as I say, I'm a relentless optimist, and the darkest hour is before the dawn. It may have taken Rachel Reeves to point out some of the flaws in the direction of travel in the UK economy in general. And the job of work right now for my colleagues in the shadow cabinet is to be putting in place plans that are going to make it be properly different when we get the next centre-right government, properly different, not just back to where we were before we were roundly kicked out by the electorate, properly different. Supply side, you've got to get back to the state spending a smaller amount of money. We're approaching the point, almost 1 in every £2 in the economy is spent by the state. Now, again, that has implications for our freedom, let alone for the effectiveness of our economy in terms of growth.
Yeah, so
you've got to break out of this failed consensus.
I'm wholly with you. I mean, here's a number I like to conjure with. It's a very broad brush picture. The position on the economy is a lot more complicated than this. But if you were to look at the Soviet Union as was, most economic historians agree that state spending in the USSR was about 70% of national income. It's hard to measure because you've got to make judgments about the black market economy and the grey market economy, but about 70% of all economic activity was government spending. You point to Singapore and some of the fastest growing countries in the world, typically 20%.
Yeah, it's a little bit less than Singapore.
And we in the UK, 44, 45%, right? Yeah. So on that metric, and there are others, I'm not going to be too binary about this, we have decided to position ourselves about halfway between Singapore and the former Soviet Union. I mean, that can't be the right positioning on the economic spectrum, can it?
No, it can't. And you'll get lots of people who just say, well, it can't. That's almost not the point. The point is then, okay, what are you going to do about it? And how is that going to be credible? Look, I came in at effectively the tail end of those 14 years in government. I regret deeply that the number of things that we didn't do, a Conservative government with a majority of 80 did not take the chance to do it. Just some good things. Brexit, gave us back the freedom to make our own laws. I never found that to be an objectionable point. It just gets us back to the same place on things like trade as Canada. But what you can't argue we really did in that 14 years is roll back the size of the state. We didn't liberate.
Quite the opposite.
Quite the opposite. You didn't live. I mean, there were ups and downs, but net, and COVID was obviously, people would rightly defend COVID as being a 1 in 100 event. But your point is right. It's the same point I agree with. It's the moral mission now of the centre-right to come up with a set of plans across the piece, but the economy is a big part of that. Business is my background and what I'm passionate about. How are we going to free properly the yoke of regulation under which so many slave? Yeah. I was the best job I had in government was city minister. I had a lot of autonomy, a lot of support from Chancellor Hunt, and we genuinely came up with some supply side reforms to reduce the role of regulation, put more risk into the system. Now, we didn't have long enough for a lot of those to fructify. Some of those are still happening. But I mean, the whole financial regulatory system essentially was trying to remove all risk, right? Post 2008, and you taking risk is fundamental. Yeah. And by the way, you can't grow an economy, the single largest sector of our UK economy, we're lucky in that it's services, is financial and professional services. Second, life sciences.
Yeah.
You know, we can't survive as a country with anything like the level of prosperity unless we get some of these right. So you need proper reform. And I'm not going to be a business and trade secretary that says, you know, one line of a manifesto, we're going to cut red tape, and then there's no blooming plan, and you get into government and you start coming up with mad ideas like a Premier League football regulator.
What we really need now is to regulate football. That's
Correct.
the dying embers of the Tory government.
Correct.
And really our most successful export pound for pound, what we need is to now cover that in red tape, apparently.
Correct. And it's not very PC, but I mean, that was a properly nuts idea, and many opposed it at the time. And, you know, why waste parliamentary time on something like a smoking ban when smoking's already vanishingly small? You know, just like, let's go in the other direction and let's make proper plans and then get into power and then enact them.
So Michael Casey asks, given the dire state of the country, once this hopeless Labour government is thrown out, will we be back to another Cameron austerity period? And maybe I can just add an addendum to that. You know, do you envisage that the next right of centre government, and we might come to what likely exact flavour or rosette that will wear a bit later in the show.
I hope Conservative for the record.
I know. You're bound to say that you've got a dog in that fight. Is it just going to be a question of sort of standing on the steps and saying, I'm terribly sorry, guys, you know, spending's got out of control. We're going to have to go through everything with a tooth comb. It's going to be very painful and difficult. We're going to have to make cuts. I mean, the coalition government, in fairness, did, but I think cut overall government expenditure in real terms by about 1%, 2% over 5 years. I mean, you would have thought that they were slashing and burning. Do you think it's going to be that sort of correction just to make sure that we don't completely collapse? Or are you advocating something considerably more radical than just, if you like, balancing the books on an Excel spreadsheet so the gilt markets don't go mad?
Look, by nature, and different colleagues will be different, by nature, I'm a radical. I think the scale of the challenges we face, the intensity of the global competition is something I feel, you know, I travel internationally in business. You know, your competitors are not in your own market. They're not just down the road. Your competitors are the people who are competing for capital, for talent. People are leaving this country. It's not just rich non-doms. It's young people who are leaving this country because they see opportunity elsewhere, and the friction that people talked about even 20 years ago when you couldn't sort of re-domicile a company and whatever, those frictions have gone. So I think I am temperamentally much more radical. That requires the sort of honest leadership that I think Kemi is giving. She is talking about the honest truth. I thought she punctured the sort of you know, the emperor's new clothes thing on net zero really well, right? There was a sort of Westminster bubble consensus about net zero in 2050, which with analysis, but with telling the honest truth, she punctured very effectively. I think we've got to do that on the economy. We've got to do that on the fact that the state is spending, you know, more, living well beyond our means. The national debt, you know, lots of different people have lots of different measures. Even on some of the more conservative measures, every new child born, we're just down the road from St Thomas's Hospital, every new child born is inheriting a £40,000 share of the national debt. I personally think
put in the liabilities, it's way.
I think that's an understatement, exactly. But I'm just, you know, £40,000, you know, before you've taken your first breath, you've expelled the meconium. So we've got to certainly be willing to stand into that conversation with the British people. You don't lead people without being honest.
Yeah.
And, you know, many people say, you know, the British electorate will not vote for the cuts or whatever, or, you know, restrictions on welfare or difficult choices. Well, they did in the 70s, right? Because they recognised that you just couldn't go on as you were. And that's the argument I want us to have.
Okay, but I'm going to try and push you a bit further than that, and then perhaps we can pick through the bones of the Conservatives' 14 years in office. Ralph Godley asks, as a chartered accountant, I know the importance of corporation tax, both in paying for our government spending, but also in creating jobs, presuming profits create jobs. The UK now has its corporation tax at 25%, up from 19%, thanks to our former Conservative government. Is this the right one for going for growth in the future? And what should the UK corporation tax rate, what will you be supporting as the UK corporation tax rate? Now, I know that's just one part of the mosaic, right?
Yeah.
And, but it's indicative, isn't it, that the Conservatives, I mean, less enthusiastically than Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer, but nevertheless, the general lever reached for under the 14 years of Conservative government was it's easier to put up tax than to cut spending. It's easier to regulate something than deregulate something, which has led us to this sorry path. I mean, I'm extremely glad that the Conservatives kept Jeremy Corbyn out of office in both 2017 and 2019. That would have been far worse.
A little bit worse.
Absolutely, catastrophically worse. But what I guess I'm trying to tease out of you, Andrew, is your prescription, we have to do this because needs must. We have to take this treatment because we're ill. Or are you actually a bit more optimistic about that and say, well, I'm not cutting government expenditure by 10%, 20%, 30% because I have to. I'm cutting it because I want to, because I think this is a wasteful, stupid way for a country to run its economic affairs.
I think there is a moral virtue in people keeping more of what they earn. I'm very, very worried about incentives, whether it's incentive to stay in this country, whether it's incentive to build a family business and pass it on to the next generation, to start a business in the first place. My political hero, if you like, was Lord David Young. I genuinely think he did more for entrepreneurship than anyone else in Westminster ever before or since. And I'd certainly like to take that as part of my mission if I went into government as business secretary. But there's a moral virtue in doing that. It's blooming hard, right? It's risky. Stepping outside the 9 to 5, it's risky. You're making moral contracts with people. When you give them a job, when you try and keep your customers happy, these are good things. We should celebrate this. So to me, look, we do have to do this, right? I mean, the patient is bleeding out at the moment. So any government coming in is going to have to make all of these tough choices anyway. But I think it's much better than that. I think it's how do you get us once again to be one of the most prosperous nations on earth? How do you be able to say to your children and grandchildren, you live in Great Britain and it's great. And we have better quality healthcare. We have longer lives. You can aspire to a better standard of productivity. When you travel, you won't find the rest of the world more expensive because your pound doesn't go as far as it used to be.
Okay.
I want all of those things.
Looks like, as we're speaking this evening, Andrew, that the Labour government suddenly come up with a plan and a silver bullet that we're going to hear from the Prime Minister likely tomorrow, that the solution to a lot of our ills, or at least the immigration problem, is going to be the introduction of digital ID. Lynn Joyce asks, will the Conservatives repeal the proposed digital ID laws? I'm a long-standing opponent of these plans. They seem to me to be a solution looking for a problem. When I first set up No to ID more than 20 years ago, apparently this was going to be the way to beat Al-Qaeda. Now it's going to be the way to close down the asylum hotels. What is the Conservative Party position on this?
Well, I can give you my position. I don't think we've seen the details of the proposal, but I'm against. I'm not a supporter of this. The only caveat is, of course, Mark, if you want a digital rendition of your driving license or other government documents, that's fine.
But that's uncontroversial.
That should be uncontroversial. I'm not against I'm not in favour of a greater integrated government database. And I'm certainly not in favour of a compulsory ID card. As you say, I've not heard what the use case is. So many of the failings of the state, and there are legion, particularly in, failure to control our borders, the sense of law and order, street crime, shoplifting. These are not issues of identification. You've got shops in my constituency who circulate the identity and the name of the prolific shoplifter again and again and again. When people come to our country illegally at the borders, at Western Jetfoil, we absolutely, any government, including Keir Starmer's government, has the option of insisting on mandatory DNA and biometric tests, of the most profound nature, in order to ensure that there is no issue whatsoever of identity. And when your bike gets nicked or your mobile phone, the police can use technology to identify it to a 4-meter square box the size of the studio, if they wanted to apprehend the culprit. If someone's in an asylum hotel, we're paying for the room, we're paying for the food service. It turns out we're also paying for a £600 taxi for them to go to the GP. These are not problems of identity.
Yeah.
So if people want to engage in a conversation about, identity cards, let's talk about problems of identity, not problems of state failure, the lack of state will.
Yeah. I mean, John Strafford's just chipped in on this. I mean, my understanding of it is in order to legally work here, I mean, there are exceptions if you're self-employed, so we might need to nuance the system. But John Strafford asked, why can't we just use national insurance numbers as national ID? But again, this goes to me that we need to prove different things at different times, right? So in order to be eligible for benefits, you need a national insurance card. I think that would also be something you'd need to prove if you're on a PAYE scheme as well. In order to access the National Health Service, you need a National Health Service number. In order to drive a car, you need a driving license. In order to practice as a brain surgeon, you need a brain surgeon license. I mean, and I'm very happy for these things to be digital rather than pieces of paper, but I want them to be separate. Correct. I don't want my national insurance number linked to my NHS number, linked to my educational records, linked to my driving license, linked to any criminal record I might have, linked to my tax records. Correct. Separate. But and the government can't run any of these, right? There's 8 million more national insurance numbers than there are people in Britain. Yeah. So if you can't even run that bit, why on earth will this government super infrastructure ID database suddenly be the miracle cure when they can't even do the basic stuff?
Correct. And the harms, you know, we're being asked, I think, on a false prospectus to give up a great many of our freedoms, and the harms out there are much greater. You know, you've seen effectively the government has had, you know, a policy of trying to have differential justice for people who've caused digital offence, you know, in a dematerialised world, rather than those who've caused physical harm on our streets. I think that's fair to say. Investigative reporting. I mean, I was the minister at the time of debanking, and everyone remembers Nigel Farage, and I picked up and helped him with his case. But before that, I helped Toby Young, and Toby's, you know, Toby was debanked by the system, you know, not for anything criminal or anything even remotely like that, but just by middle-ranking officials, you know, using data, effectively making him a non-person. Right, proper Orwellian stuff. No right of appeal, no sanction. Computer says no, and you can become an unperson. Now, imagine if you've integrated every single domain of your life. You can't really operate without a bank account these days. You know, it's pretty hard to go and buy. You can't buy a bus ticket for cash, for example. And so whole swathes of national life. Now, Toby's also, you know, a journalist, and imagine being an investigative journalist. If the state has the ability, you know, if you get a bit too close, and you've seen every government scandal from post office to Flexible Blood has had it's had an investigative journalism being the grit in the oyster. And at least at the start of that, with hindsight, everyone says, oh, wasn't it wonderful? At the start of that process, you know, was someone making very uncomfortable comments, questions, and it'd be very hard to do that if the state had this ability to control.
So why has Kemi said in her tweet, I mean, she's criticised the Prime Minister for coming out and announcing digital ID. She says it's a distraction, it won't stop the boats. But she says there are arguments for and against, and we need a debate about it, right? I mean, I always worry about any politician of any stripe who says what we need now is a debate. I mean, we just need to take a line on this, right?
Look, a bit of both. I mean, you know, we're having a debate. It happens that we both agree, and we both have some quite visceral first principle views on it. If you're leader of the opposition and you've seen literally no proposal whatsoever because you've had some number 10 leaking and briefing operation, you know, that's probably, you know, the right approach to take. I mean, I assume everyone in PopCom is interested in the debate. You've got my view. I'm not the leader of the opposition, and it's something I've had a lot of time to think about, and have had some personal exposure through my role as the debanking minister, as it were.
Okay. I want us to roll back a bit now and go a bit for the kind of physician heal thyself approach to it. So pretty easy, shooting fish in a barrel, target-rich environment to criticise this appalling Labour government. You know, should be able to make hay out of that.
But we haven't talked about the Employment Rights Bill. So if anyone can ever not sleep and wants a proper stuff of nightmares, you know, do spend a little bit of time on that.
It's going to get worse and worse and worse. But I'll come back to some of the things that I think we need to oppose. And you've been leading the opposition on what you've correctly called the Unemployment Rights Bill rather than the Employment Rights Bill. But I think for Conservatives to be trusted again and to have even the remotest chance of winning an election, we've got to have a compelling analysis of what happened 2010 to 2014, right? And I have repeated this thought experiment again and again and again, but I'd like your reaction to it. If you took a snapshot of the UK in 2010, when Cameron becomes Prime Minister, albeit a coalition government, but nevertheless, the Conservatives are back in power after 13 years in opposition, very long stretch of time for the Conservative Party to be out of power. Take a snapshot of what Britain looks like then. Forward wind to June 2024, when the Conservative Party loses office, take a snapshot then. These are just your 2 points of reference. Britain had not become more conservative in any way whatsoever, under any metric you care to name. I mean, there might have been some tiny little victories here, there, or everywhere. But in terms of the broad sweep, the metrics you might measure, what is taxation as a proportion of national income? Are we practicing fiscal conservatism or fiscal incontinence? Has regulation gone up or down? Have basically personal freedoms gone up or down? Are we pursuing crazy stuff in the state sector around diversity, equality, and inclusion? Have we decided it is our grand national project to stamp out every CO2 molecule that enters the atmosphere rather than being an energy efficient country? My view is, if you just had those 2 snapshots to go on, and you put it to somebody who had not followed a single iota of British political history over that period of time, they would reach the conclusion that we had had a woke left-wing socialist government for 14 years, from 2010 to 2024, that had moved the country in a higher tax, more spending, more regulating, more woke ideology direction. Do you agree that that is the conclusion that an objective observer would reach? And why? How on earth did that happen over a decade and a half, nearly, of Tory government?
I'll have to try and keep the answer short. You've obviously rehearsed that theme very many times, and I've read that before. There's one discordant point which we should celebrate, which is the ability to make our own laws. That Parliament was sovereign at the end of that period over about 40% more domains of national life, including...
Because the people voted for Brexit in a referendum against the leadership of the Tory party.
Well, look, I mean, I was only even remotely involved in politics in the last 5 year slice of that, and so I'm not disagreeing with your theme. To be clear, Mark, I'm just trying to. I'm not even trying to balance the scorecard. I'm just saying there is one thing that we can all take heart of, and it's a really important thing because it does mean the jumping off point, the next Conservative government, will be that much better because we've got back control over that. Look, I think the fundamental failure, if I may, is that we didn't really get to grips with the Blair settlement. And there were all sorts of bear traps and pitfalls in my area of the business and the economy. They were all about quangos, about ceding power to unaccountable quangos, the city regulators, the environmental regulators, all of the different low pay bodies agitating for a particular type of change. So there, it seemed to me, we didn't do anything. We didn't inflict any sort of scratch, flesh wound on that whole Blairite settlement. And I think, from everything I see, and it's not my domain, in terms of the justice system, the whole legal system, the whole operation, and again, including judicial review, when we talk about planning reform, I would love to see a lot more deregulation in planning. But unless you fix the issue of constant judicial review, as a local member of parliament, I run around parish councils who live in fear and jeopardy of judicial review. Now, they're not always subject to it, but this whole sense of the legal system second guessing everything, every decision made, including all of those made by democratic bodies, or those with a specific mandate, is second guessed by the legal system. And we see that on steroids in areas of equalities, human rights, immigration law. So, the basic thesis is we didn't get to grips with it, not because my predecessors were bad people, not for the most part that they weren't trying to do the right thing. They would have been talking about the same sort of things of reducing the size of the state and supply side. 2 key things that has to be different next time round: plans and people, right? You've got to have clear plans. I mean, obviously, I don't agree with everything from Donald Trump and any other US politician. It's a different system. But that sense of going in and having already written your plans, your corpus for government. I mean, I hark back to Newt Gingrich and the contract with America, because that seemed to me you'd done all your thinking up front and you had a clear set of plans as to what you're going to do. So I will, for you, if I'm your business secretary, I will have a clear list of regulators, the ones we're going to close, the ones we're going to reduce in size, the laws that underlie those that we're going to have to change, and that will be ready before we go into government. Ditto an industrial strategy, right? Industrial strategy, just a set of choices. It doesn't have to be a 1960s style one. We'll have that ready. It's taken the government 18 months to cut and paste the industrial strategy. Nonsense, waste of time. And the people thing is we need an army of people, many of them from the business community, who are willing to go in and serve on all of the quangos that are left, fewer, but there'll still be some, and help us bend the system to our will. And when my involvement in government is, we didn't appoint our own friends and supporters. We often appointed people who are saboteurs and actively worked against us.
Fair-minded. To give the other side.
Fair-minded, naive, and no plan. Right? No plan.
I mean, extraordinarily.
Who was that guy who ended up running Natural England? Tony Juniper. Yeah. Right. I mean, not by. I mean. Lefties can be all right, but just not bought into our view of the world at all.
I'm so glad you're saying this, because it seems to me that is the fundamental problem, right? That, I mean, we had 5 Conservative prime ministers in a row. No doubt you can point to weaknesses and foibles and bad decisions made by each of them. But that doesn't strike me that was the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem was that for 14 years, the Conservatives tried to run a system which was now so geared against conservatism that any effort to cut taxes or deregulate or get spending under control, or not going on some weird woke adventure about climate change,
killing ESG, killing the city, and
so it was roughly the equivalent. I mean, in terms of a challenge, I don't mean in the impact on humanity, of being a kind of libertarian-leaning capitalist on Brezhnev's Politburo. I mean, kind of pointless. If you're not going to change the system, you're not going to get anywhere.
You've got to change the people, you see. I mean, if to use the Politburo analogy, you need your Politburo, you need people.
But you also need to close down the Agricultural Pricing Committee and the Bread Redistribution Committee, and you need to open yourselves up to markets. Sure. If you keep the communist system, I'm not suggesting leaving the communist state, but if you keep the system in place, you're done for. I mean, I've spoken to previous Conservative health secretaries who were saying, really kind of, what's the point of me? NHS England run the whole gig. I was looking for bits around the edges where I might be able to make a difference. We've got a kind of Potemkin parliament that we pretend these politicians are in control, but in fact, it's
correct, and that
largely ceremonial.
Correct, I agree with that, and the failure to recognise that and to get to grips with it for whatever reason, was why I don't think we achieved anything that we could have achieved. Because at the end of the day, ministers would try and decide, and they would run slap back into, oh, sorry, I'm an independent arm's length regulator, or the law says you can't change this, or even if you try and change it, I'm sorry, Minister, we're going to have to go out to consultation. I mean, you had in many departments, including the Treasury, you had double consultation. So the Treasury had to consult on a change, then it went down to the regulator, and they went and consulted on the same change. Completely indefensible. No good reason.
But oddly enough, everything seemed to pass quite smoothly if you were consulting about the state doing more, right? I mean, bringing in this ludicrous football regulator was consulted about. I was absolutely certain it was only going to end up in one direction, that everybody was going to conclude that regulating football in England was a marvellous thing to do because the market was out of control. Or consultations happen, but the left side of the ledger always seems to win, right? It doesn't come back and say, what a crazy idea.
Well, I have a personal beef on these sort of things, because what will happen, I've got what I call the second glass of red wine test, Mark. So what will happen is that publicly, and I'm pretty sure this would have happened, I wasn't that close to it, the businesses, the enterprises that we desperately need to keep alive, and their expanded public affairs teams, apologies if that's you listening, would have sensed the way the wind was going, and they wouldn't have put in the proper opposition to the consultation, and you saw that again and again. And then what I call the second glass of red wine test is then you sit down with the real decision maker, the CEO or the chairman, and by the second glass of red wine, they're saying, this is effing nuts, Andrew. Why is this happening? But, there's this sort of big emperor's new clothes where nobody within the system wants to say, this is completely mad, I'm against it.
So
it's like net zero, right? Everyone's signed up to net zero. It's proper emperor's new clothes.
It's beyond ludicrous. I mean, I'm not a full-blown climate change skeptic.
No,
but the idea that the overriding drive of the economy is that the state has successfully worked out the exact number of CO2 molecules that need to be in the British atmosphere at 1 minute past midnight on the 1st of January 2050 is central planning gone absolutely bananas, right? So if we're agreed that this is happening everywhere, what does this reboot look like? I mean, you've referenced Trump, for example, who, whether you love him or loathe him, or there are bits about Trump that you might be sympathetic to and other bits less sympathetic to.
It was more the process of sort of going in. Trump v one, I think broadly everyone thinks was a disaster, right? Didn't get all the appointments. This time round,
he's rolling out.
Again, love him or loathe him, all of his appointments were made prior to inauguration of his secretaries of state, and there were clearly a whole load of executive orders which had been premeditated and drawn up. That's the difference. It's the approach of having a clear set of plans and people. So you can have your principles, which the Conservative Party broadly unchanged, right? You wouldn't expect them to change from the ones when I joined the party in the early 80s. Your manifesto, your actual policies will need to speak to the priorities of people at the time. You've got to get elected. Sure. But then you have properly underneath it, and this is what excites me and people like me are spending our time doing, is the detailed plans. And I'm building a hopper of people who say to me, look, I'm perfectly happy to be considered to go and sit on one of these government bodies or quangos, in pursuit of that mission of getting our country growing again. Okay,
but here's my thing, right? So is it a personnel issue, or don't we just need to shut these things down by and large? So I'm really irritated that Labour has made one modest reform, because a few months ago there were 444 quangos in Britain. It's a very easy number to remember, although I've always wanted it to be 666 rather than 444. I think it's now 438. Now, all right, we could attempt to get right-thinking people on the board of Natural England or the museums and the Arts Council and all the rest of it. But I think that's probably a fool's errand, because generally speaking, people of our ilk don't want to go around regulating other people's lives, right? So they don't want to be in charge of what is the appropriate pricing of a pint of milk in Derbyshire or wherever you're investigating. They want to go and make money and set up businesses and live life in the free side of the economy. So, to my mind, without wanting to sound completely destructive, because I don't want a revolution in Britain, but I want a restoration. And I think I want us to go through all 444 quangos and basically privatise them, abolish them, or put their functions directly under ministerial control. And the idea of a quango just wouldn't exist anymore. If you're the Environment Secretary in the next Conservative government, the Environment Agency, their functions like flood defences or whatever, they need to report to you.
Yes.
Right. So we saw this nonsense with the Sentencing Guidance Council, completely distinct from the Justice Secretary. I totally understand that the Justice Secretary might want some experts to advise him or her about what's going right or wrong in sentencing, but they need to report to the Justice Secretary. So rather than populating these socialist quangos with our people, why don't we just kill them off?
Let me save your blood pressure. I agree. Right. So far fewer of these bodies. I mean, we may do with far fewer of them when we were last in government. So, a lot of them have expanded on our watch. Direct line of what I call dispatch box line accountability. So every one of those, you've got to be able to summon somebody to the dispatch box in Parliament if you believe in the parliamentary democratic system. And they've actually got to be the ability to ultimately make that change and call the shots. And even of the ones that survive, fewer people, because the only ultimate way of rationing things is time. No regulator ever has put itself out of business.
Yeah,
I remember I was in the broadcast sector. I remember being sold Ofcom was going to be a light touch strategic regulator. Just a couple of dozen people will. And now it's like way through 1,000. It's still hiring. It just keeps finding more and more scope to regulate, and that is a natural human existence.
But why don't you just shutter it then?
I mean, that's certainly an option. I mean, I'm not going to go through the 444 right now, but we are going to go through the department by department, and there will be some shuttering. I mean, there'll be some chainsaws being deployed. You have to do that, not just because of the direct costs. There is no point as just paying lip service to making a smaller state if we're not willing to reduce the direct costs, but also that is the thing. When we talk about supply side, when you talk about getting an economy growing, it's the vast number of people on the public purse who are empowered to say no. They see it as their job to say no. I mean, I would pay every civil servant based on GDP per capita. There's no inflation indexing anymore.
MPs even.
For sure, bring that one on. I'm very comfortable with that. But GDP per capita, so if the economy doesn't grow as it's not, or GDP per capita's fallen in some quarters, then everyone gets a pay cut. And that would, at the very least, concentrate people's minds. Like, oh, okay, this is what I'm here to do.
Yeah.
Rather than
essentially the incentives are misaligned, right?
Completely misaligned.
You're right that no regulator puts itself out of business. When it's apparently solved a problem, it moves on to a different problem. Ofcom, classic example, it began as the Broadcasting Standards Council on a micro budget.
And the Radio Authority.
What about not just the Quangos, but Margaret Parker asks, what about the civil service themselves, right? And I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist here because too many people have watched every episode of Yes Minister and thinks it really works like that. And I'm also quite certain that a good number of people, a majority who work for the civil service, are decent public servants. But I think they are now part and parcel of effectively an ideological mindset around central planning, generally unsympathetic to conservative ends, even if it's deeply embedded in their subconsciousness. I'm not saying that they're all undermining a minister deliberately morning, noon and night, although no doubt some are leaking information to undermine political figures who they are unsympathetic to. Isn't it time to move on from the Norfolk Trevelyan deal, that we live in this fantasy world that all of the civil service are objective and neutral? Shouldn't we instead say, at the top level, I'm probably looking at about 3,000 civil servants who are involved in policy making, Barry in accounts or Jill who does the filing, that's fine. I don't really care what their political views are. But if you're involved in policy making and deliberation, you should be a political appointee. We get rid of SPADs, we get rid of special advisors. If you're the Transport Secretary, for sake of argument, you pick your top 8 or 10 people. And no doubt you will have to choose a balance of people who are expert in the subject and ideologically sympathetic to what you're attempting to achieve. You, therefore, as the Secretary of State, you're effectively the Chief Executive of the Transport Department, and the top brass should be your picks.
Yes and no, right? I've got a slightly different view on this. And I've worked in and led big organizations. And a lot of it, I believe, is about incentives. It's not about people being malicious or positive. And I think a lot of the incentives are wrong, right? The first thing I really rail against is that our civil servants are fully remunerated not to take risk.
Yeah.
Right. So they go in and they're very, you essentially you get good raw material, the same material that would go to lots of other private sector organizations. And the way to personal enrichment as a civil service is never do anything, never ever go anywhere near a change project.
Yeah.
Right. Never do that, because
never get legally infracted.
Then there's some personal accountability. Don't push the envelope or even approach the legal line, because then you can there's sanctions. And if you really just stay there, and if you glide between different jobs and different departments for a very long career, we'll actually give you a real king's ransom. Probably some sort of
you rise without
some
trace.
sort of honour.
You rise without trace.
Well, there's this expression in the civil service called promoting up.
Yeah.
And so, but it's the incentives, right? There's very little individual accountability. I think ministers have a bit to answer for in terms of their personal leadership. I enjoyed working with all of my civil servants, and I didn't just have a charmed life. I did have mostly economic departments. I worked in the Treasury, DBT, DSIT. So they they were more outward facing into the real economy. They might have actually met a business person or two in my departments. But there I felt I gave them good leadership, and it was very clear what we wanted. We were trying to do some long-term things, not just chase headlines or come up with some announcement for the minister to make tomorrow. And I think with that, you can make the system work a lot better. Secretaries of State can appoint their own advisor teams, not just SPADs, but Michael Gove, who I disagreed with on a great many policies. He knows that, I know that, but he was very effective. He brought people in from outside into government at senior levels. He surrounded himself with a talented team of people outside. And so I think you can do that within the system. So I'll back off a little bit and say, look, I think quite a lot of it is about, if you don't know what you want, if you go into government, you haven't got a clear plan, no civil service, however doctrinarily aligned with you or not, is going to be able to do a good job.
Okay, no, I get that. Maybe I'm pushing the boat a little bit too far, but let me try and just push it again one more time.
These are touches on the tiller. We're not in disagreement here.
What I get infuriated about, and I've heard this from both former Conservative cabinet ministers and Labour cabinet ministers, is this line that sort of, well, if you're the Secretary of State and kind of know what you want, you can find a way to get it done. Well, I mean, that's pretty obtuse, isn't it? That you've got to have some brilliant Machiavellian bureaucratic tactical plan to work out exactly how you're going to navigate your way through the system. No business would operate like this. So why not align incentives by saying, right, Andrew Griffith, you are now the Secretary of State for Business or in some other role. You presumably have got a plan. I mean, if you don't have a plan, or you have a very poor plan, or you don't want to change anything, you're going to be at best an average CEO. You've now got the plan. You're going to need, I don't know, 5, 10, 20, 50, 100 people to help you implement it. And they are answerable to you. So you might be mad enough to say, Littlewood, I actually want you to come and work for me to implement this bit. Do you understand it? Do you understand what we're attempting to achieve? These are your KPIs. I need to get these 10 regulators abolished. You're in charge of making sure we can smoothly get rid of these 5. And if I don't deliver to you, you fire me. Now, what's unbelievable at the moment is the complete inability of any Secretary of State to be able to get rid of their senior staff. You'd never tolerate this in the business sector. So, as I say, the more administrative element of it, I'm less interested in. Who opens the post or whatever barely matters. But if you can't fire the people who are your closest advisors, it's going to be very difficult for you to actually execute a plan unless you've got some the Prince by Machiavelli way with the brilliant
Jedi mind powers
of Michael Gove. Michael Gove's Jedi powers. I don't want our politics to be like that. I want our politicians to say, this is what I want done. I want them to appoint people to help them do it. Those people need to be answerable to the senior person, namely the Secretary of State. And if it doesn't work out, you get rid of them.
Look, I think subtle differences between us, nothing profound. That to me, how do you make it work in whichever system, right? Whatever the formal authorities, because business CEOs don't go around hiring and firing all the time. You do have to drive goal alignment. That is a key difference. But you don't anyway get people to follow you by sort of threatening to fire them. The issue
you don't have to because they're already aligned.
But the issue I have, and I think where we can do a great deal better, is this whole point about finding people to sign on to those missions. And I think there are many people in the private sector, not exclusively, who, if you give them a clear mission and say, look, we've got this great institution, British Business Bank, but it's really not doing what we want it to do in its current form. Can you lead that? Can you bring your skills to bear? Will you work for me as the Secretary of State, being the chairman or the chief executive of that bank? These are the sort of roles.
Institution, why don't you just get rid of it?
Giving you an example. But these are sort of roles where, if you've got a whole hinterland of people that on day one are ready to be appointed, as in the US system, that is one thing. If you go into government, you have no plan, you've got no list of people, and you are suddenly, as I have seen happen, on Sunday night, the Secretary of State is sort of WhatsApping around saying, anyone heard of this Mark Littlewood guy? Should we make him governor of the Bank of England? Right? It's like,
yes, is the answer to that question. I'm very glad you got that WhatsApp. I'm very annoyed it wasn't responded to.
You need a different approach. You need a different approach, Mark.
No, I agree with that.
And we will do that, right? So literally one of the things that I am doing as Shadow Business Secretary, is trying to reach out and build networks of people, and there are a great many, who are keen to come and help that mission of saving our country.
Right. I want to finish by looking at what the future of the right might look like, right? Because the Conservative Party has been, I think it's fair to say, it's often said, but I think it's also fair, the most successful political party anywhere in the world in the history of democracy. Unbelievable success. Its ability to reinvent itself. Well, I mean, the foundation of the Tory party at the 1835 Tamworth Manifesto was a reinvention, an inheritance from the Tories. And since then, through Disraeli, through Churchill, onto Thatcher, its ability to move with the times and to work out what changes have happened in the world that it's going to go along with and which it's not. So, and has done that spectacularly successfully. Hence, notwithstanding the catastrophic defeat last June, when was it? June or July? July, wasn't it? Yeah. We had our election on American Independence Day, and they had their election on Bonfire Night. Yeah. Jacob Rees-Mogg always fond of pointing out to me that although the Conservatives are brilliant at winning elections, they also have quite a history of losing some elections catastrophically. But as we're sitting here today, the position for the Conservative Party electorally doesn't merely seem to be bleak, it does appear to be existential. An opinion poll today, right, maybe an outlier, puts the Conservatives down at 14% of the vote, 2% behind the Liberal Democrats, in fourth place. That is worse than most recent polling, but not off by a mile. I know Tory party members who are punching the air if an opinion poll comes out putting us at 20% of the vote. That's, oh, great, we're back in the business. At the last election, I think we got 24% of the vote, lost 2/3 of our seats, still the official opposition, but down to 121 MPs. And Nigel Farage appears to be eating our lunch. If you were writing the story or the history of 2020 to 2030, how the Tory party died, the first 5 years are the first 5 chapters of that book, aren't they? Why won't chapters 6 to 10 be written? I mean, this isn't just a position which is tricky or difficult. It is overwhelmingly existential, isn't it? And there's every reason to believe that the Conservative Party, despite its very long and successful history, could now go the way that the Liberal Party went 100 years ago. It will continue to exist. I get annoyed with Conservatives who keep saying to me, oh, we have no right to exist. Oh, you've got every right to exist. There's 500 or so political parties registered with the Electoral Commission. You've got every right to exist, but you don't have a right to be taken seriously or to expect to win. And things have worsened since the general election in terms of the popular support for the Conservative Party. How does that change? Is it the patience of a saint, or is it a completely new strategy, especially given this insurgency on the right of reform?
Unlike most of your guests, I would say I'm not a professional politician, right? I mean, I've always supported the party, but I've only been involved in it and member of parliament relatively recently. Mm-hmm. I am an optimist. I think, I'm not an extremist on any particular viewpoint. And when people sort of say existential, I mean, that's what the climate, people say, and they use that to justify all sorts of extreme measures. So I don't think that is right. You've got to be humble. Who knows? We all serve at the whim of the electorate. It doesn't surprise me, Mark, that we are where we are. And you just look what's actually happened. What's the unique feature about this particular moment in time? It's not our catastrophic defeat, though that was catastrophic and of a very large magnitude. The actual unusual feature at this point in the cycle, just over 1 year in, is the catastrophic collapse of support for this government. And I lived through all those Blair years, they came on in, people weren't sure, and it almost got better for them. This government has come in, they turned, what was a pretty low floor anyway into a ceiling, and their support. So it's clearly, whether it's the Greens, to pick an example, on the left, or other parties on the right, there's clearly a lot of people who are saying to themselves, essentially, look, I was a brand A, right? I stuck with brand A for a long time. I then went for brand B because I'd sort of fallen out of love with brand A.
Yeah.
It wasn't working for me. And you know what? Brand B, blooming hell. 1 year in, brand B is even worse. So I'm not immediately going to jump back to A, no matter what they do. They could sort of pretty much walk on water. They could repent every last sin. I'm still not going back to A because I'm a consumer. Consumers don't flip around that quickly, and they don't reverse because that would be dissonant. So they're shopping around for an alternative. And if you're on the left, it's, as I say, it's probably the Greens, and it'll be another left-wing party. If it's on the right, of course, it's Reform, because they've got a good turn of phrase, and they've got what seem to be some solutions to some of the things that people have been worried about. Now, I just think that's very fertile territory for a revitalised Conservative Party, which over time develops a clearer set of plans. I don't think the next election from us can be a trust me election. It's going to have to be a show me election, right? I'm not going to you can't just say, we'll grow the economy. It's like, how are you going to do that? How are you going to? I think immigration will actually not be the issue at the next election. I think it will be the economy. I think it'll be things like youth unemployment that is ticking up and up and up, and everything the government is doing is going to deprive young people of their step into work.
Sure.
Tragic. And we can position ourselves against those trends. So the simple answer is, look, it will take a bit of time. I mean, definitely, I don't think you can expect things to turn around overnight. And I think it has to be policy led, and in a political system, if you've got more compelling policies that are also credible than the next guy or girl, then you're in with a chance.
This is really interesting. I just want to stretch your analogy a little further and see if you buy into this. That is picking a political party a question of brands, or is something rather bigger happening than that? Are Reform just brand C? Different type of, slightly different flavour of cornflakes to the Conservative Party, or is the Conservative Party in the blacksmith trade and Reform is a car? That there's actually a change of type happening, not just a change of brand. And that what held the Conservatives together over our lifetimes, where there'll be many disagreements and different flavours of conservatism within the party, but it was mainly pro-business, not always completely pro-market, but business matters, staunch opposition to the Soviet Union, faith in national institutions, the police, the army, the monarchy, a kind of middle of the road approach on social conservatism against liberalism. So, not manically socially conservative, but also a bit hesitant about new freedoms coming in. That was enough to hold, say, John Gummer and John Redwood in the same party, right? But now the issues are, where do you stand on international institutions? Are you sceptical about them, hostile about them, or do you believe they're an important part of our infrastructure? Do you think carbon net zero is a necessity to save the human race, or do you think it's garbage? Do you think immigration is by and large a useful part of our economy, or do you think it's completely out of control and a drain on the state? And I'm not making any judgment about which line you might pick, but I just have a worrying feeling that to every binary new question, the Conservatives are giving the answer 0.5. And you actually have Corbyn and the Greens, giving very clear answers on one side and Farage on the other. That's what happened to the Liberal Party 100 years ago, being held together by free trade, support for the empire, and support for enfranchisement of an ever wider middle class. Suddenly the questions became, do you support the emergence of a welfare state in 1914? Do you support the conscription of men to fight a world war? And suddenly the Liberal Party didn't have a line on this. And if you take carbon net zero as an example, Reform think it's all complete garbage. The Conservative position seems to be, well, it's not possible to get there by 2050. Well, I wonder whether that's a rather nuanced view in a very binary meme and vibe age.
Time will tell. Let's be humble about these. I tend not to think that. I don't think it's very fair, by the way, to say that the Conservatives are in an equidistant position. That's not true. On something like re-exploiting our energy resources in the North Sea, we are all in. No ifs, no buts. Very, very clear. On things like family firm, death tax, all very clear. The Employment Rights Bill, all of the rights for trade unions that are being conferred on them by Labour. None of this ratchet nonsense. Where we get in and we inherit that. We will repeal. Okay, so I think we've got some pretty clear positions on some things. Look, I think there is work to be done. Right? It'd be foolish to come and say, look, there is not work to be done. Parties succeed by building coalitions. All of us should worry intensely, for example, about young people, and they're not always that young, but how do you build out from the Conservative strength in older groups, which is a big population group and it's still growing, but how do you build out into people who are younger and more aspirational? I worry a lot about that.
Yeah.
I think a lot about that. And there isn't, there's work to be done on the policy front on that. The rest of it we will see. I think if you look at history, it is very rare that you get these disruptive moments in business, right? The people who built the first planes, they were flying boats, and they'd previously been shipbuilders.
Yeah.
Right. The people who, in every industry, people who built computers had previously built medical and scientific instruments.
Yeah.
And TV came out of radio. So I don't tend to think you get these really radical changes. But as you say, parties need to adapt. We need to go back and remind people of who we are. And we do need to, be for some people and against people. I think the framing of makers and takers, simplistic though it is quite good, right? Whose side are we on? We're on the side of makers, right? We're on the side of people who get up in the morning and build a business and take risk. And by inference, we're actually not on your side if all you do is take from the state, beyond a certain very minimal level in society. That's not whose side we're on. We want to be on the side of people who are making and contributing.
Andrew, it's been brilliant. Thanks for incredibly lucid analysis over the past hour or so. As you say, much done. It's going to be, a long march back to power, but by God, we need it. I mean, we're unfortunately stuck with this government probably until 2029, unless something apocalyptic
I'm an optimist.
But we're going to need a government of real change as soon as we get rid of this lot. And thanks a lot. I mean, I agree with all of the ideas you've sketched out. It seems to be only a matter of degree between us. And if the broad sense of direction is that one of a future centre-right Conservative government, then you've made me an optimist about Britain too. So thanks very much indeed for your time. Thanks to all of you who have joined us live. Thanks for watching us on Catch Up if you're watching us on YouTube. We've got more Pop Conversations coming up next month. But if you are going to the Conservative Party conference, join us live in the Think Tent in the secure zone. We've got a section on the future of the right. What is the path back to power? Picking up some of the themes today. That's on Monday, the 6th of October at 2 p.m. On Tuesday, the 7th of October at 11:30, I'll also be in Think Tent in conversation with Dr. David Starkey on what does a great restoration look like. And those events will be online as well if you can't join us in person at the Conservative Party conference. You probably have already done so, otherwise you probably wouldn't know this event was happening. But if not, and you don't receive our regular Friday email bulletin, please go to www.popularconservatism.com and sign up for our regular newsletter. We won't spam you, but we'll keep you informed once a week. Andrew, again, thanks. It's been a fascinating hour. Thanks to everybody who's been watching. Take care. Over and out.